Why the heated rivalry discourse says more about hockey than the show itself. I want to make it clear up front that this is not a deep dive into homophobia in hockey culture. That can be dangerous because a lot of people think that if you're talking about structure instead of prejudice, you're minimizing prejudice, which is why I'm making a point of saying from the outset that homophobia, toxic masculinity, and locker room issues absolutely exist within hockey. Many players today are allies and would shut down overt behaviour, but the structural problems do remain. The thing is, other podcasts, journalists, and people much closer to the lived experience have explored these issues in depth. So that is why I'm not going to go into that. This is not dismissal, minimisation, or absolution of the league, teams, or hockey culture. The reason I've set that aside so I can discuss these topics is that I want to focus on a different adjacent factor that gets discussed far less. Specifically, the team-first culture, media behaviour, and how individual visibility is treated as a disruption within hockey culture. The reason I'm adopting this angle is that I've been thinking about hockey culture deeply because I've been writing hockey romance, and that's pushed me to examine narrative media framing and structural pressure. It is a question about culture and incentives that I feel better placed to explore. I feel like a lot of the discourse about the show and about homosexuality generally in the NHL has almost missed the point. Even if the league was largely supportive and personally accepting, the cost to the individual player of coming out would still be enormous, because I think that the burden goes well beyond hockey culture and into media, symbolism, and societal expectation. So for me, this isn't just about whether other players in the room would be personally accepting of the player who comes out. It's about what would actually happen to the one player who did step forward. I have been thinking about this issue for a while, but there was a trigger that made me decide to do this video. Heated Rivalry is a popular romance novel by Rachel Reed, which has been adapted into a new Amazon Prime series. It's very popular. It explores, amongst other things, gay hockey players in a fictional version of the NHL. I've read the book and I'm very casually watching the show, not very closely, because the show itself isn't what has hooked me. It's the conversation around the show, given that even now in 2025, the NHL is one of the last major men's team sports league that does not have an openly gay active player. I've been interested in the fact that until very, very recently, a lot of the mainstream media was avoiding the topic. Canadian press were covering it. Romance podcasts were covering it, particularly ones that cover gay romance. But until the What Chaos and the Empty Netters podcast started covering it, there was very little mainstream discourse about it. In particular, the Empty Netters podcast has been doing an episode by episode reaction. The two brothers that run the podcast are not in a niche fandom space. They're very much a core hockey media voice, and they have said that they're two straight guys that are hockey fans. The moment that clicked for me very recently was when Chris, one of the hosts, explained during episode 3 why he could sympathize and understand why the fictional character of Scott Hunter did not feel able to come out yet. Scott is the captain of the US team. He's elite, he's high profile and closeted. His intention is to come out after retirement, but not while he's still playing. The following is a short audio clip from the podcast.
And I think obviously I skew towards, like, I'm biased towards the hockey player in this story, right? As like we're navigating the story, and a ton of fans are watching the show not as a straight hockey player, right?
Sure.
It is hard. I think take right now. This is 2014, right?
Yeah.
But take right now the waves, the ripple effects. If an NHL player right now, a star, was like this, I'm openly gay, by the way, this is my boyfriend, would be insane. The way, how it would ripple through the league, the world, the community, everything. And I just, sometimes I'm like, man, that is a massive thing that you are asking of Scott. Like in this point, like not only is it just a person who's closeted, and she's like, please, like do this for him. He wants to be shown off, and you deserve it too. I'm like, this is an outrageous act. You would be jeopardizing his career, like his entire livelihood.
His whole life.
Yeah. And I sometimes think that's not appreciated enough in this, where like in this drama, they're like, come on, Scott. And I'm like, no, dude.
That's
like,
why
I actually watched the show being like, he literally can't. You're asking him something he literally cannot do.
Why that explanation mattered to me and resonated so much with me was that it articulated something that I'd been circling around for a very long time. It shifted the framing away from morality or bravery, but it actually reframed the issue as one of structure, pressure, and role expectation. So it was a very pragmatic and realistic and non judgmental approach to the issue that I thought was quite fascinating. So, as I've said, this is 2025. A lot of the commentary out there is very bewildered by the fact that there is no active NHL player who is openly gay. The commentary focuses on the fact that there are a lot of enlightened players in the league. Lots of the players have gay friends, gay family members. The room would be fine. A lot of the response to this conversation stops at the fact that the teammates and the players would be fine with this. But I feel like this misses where the real pressure would come from. The issue is that a high profile NHL player who comes out would no longer be treated primarily as a hockey player. What they would become instead is a public symbol, a spokesman. They would have to become an advocate for LGBTQI plus rights. So the acceptance within the room doesn't negate the cost to that player. Having allies and friendship and support from the room would not insulate that player from external pressures. Personal goodwill from the other players would not cancel structural burden. In the short term, every media scrum would become about that player's sexuality. That's just how news cycles would work. That's because currently in hockey, the players are pretty boring for the most part. They say very little. The access is very repetitive and they tend to repeat the same lines over and over again. Get pucks deep, we played well, we battled, it's about the team, we'll pick ourselves up again, we'll focus, we played hard. So the reporters are always desperate for any type of differentiation and personal elements. So, given that context, if a high profile NHL player came out, the media scrums would then become, how did your teammates react to this? How long have the other players known about this? Has this changed anything in the room? Are you comfortable being a role model? What message do you have for young fans? How has this affected the cohesiveness of the team? After that initial wave of questions, there would be features and profiles. It would be unavoidable to have these. So the league teams and outlets would want long-term features, human interest pieces, pride tie-ins, legacy framing. It wouldn't just be the media scrums, there'd probably be whole pieces and documentaries about this player. And most importantly, if that player declined to be involved in that, that would itself become a story. The narrative would become, why isn't this player using his platform to help other gay players? Is the league silencing him? Is he uncomfortable with his identity? Is this performative allyship? He doesn't really mean it. He doesn't care about other people. He is selfish. Opting out would not preserve normality. It would generate an entirely different and very negative narrative about this player who would be in an impossible bind, because if he spoke constantly, he would be accused of making it about himself and distracting from the team and derailing focus. But if he didn't speak enough, he would be accused of being ashamed about his sexuality. He would be accused of cowardice, of letting others down, and of not doing his part for the movement. And this isn't hypothetical. We have seen examples of this where players speak about their mental health, they engage in social justice issues, or even players who talk too much about contracts or future plans. They're seen as being selfish and distracting from the room and causing distraction from their teammates. The usual mantra of I'm just focusing on hockey definitely would not protect them. If a player said, yes, I'm out, I'm gay, but I just want to play hockey, this would not be treated as neutral. It would be treated as avoidance, ingratitude for the platform, or refusal to do the work that people now expect from him. And once that expectation exists, it won't just go away. The moral pressure would increase. They would be saying, you're paid millions. You owe it to others who are still closeted. Your visibility could save lives. There would be immense pressure put on this player to do more and say more. I am not rejecting the value of advocacy. Of course, it is very important that people in public roles try to use that position for good. But what I am saying is that the job description of the hockey player in question will expand whether that player consents to it or not. An NHL player's job is already physically brutal, mentally consuming, relentlessly public, and season-long with no real downtime. I've mentioned in other videos what a toll this can take on their lives, their personal lives, and how a lot of them may not have necessarily been mentally prepared for this lifestyle, given that many of them sign up to their contracts when they're very young and have very little education. Adding symbolic leadership on top of all of this is not a marginal addition. It is a second career layered on top of the first. And even for someone who is fully prepared for it, it's probably going to be very challenging. Coming out would not be contained, temporary, or remain personal. Once he came out, a gay hockey player would not be able to keep his personal life private the same way a straight player would. So in terms of team sports versus individual sports, there's a very different allocation of cost for things like this. In an individual sport like tennis or athletics or similar individual disciplines, the athlete is the product, brand, and narrative from the outset. The personal story, identity, and emotion are already part of how the sport is marketed and consumed. If backlash occurs, although it can be said to affect the reputation of the sport, it is generally framed as that individual's burden to carry. The sponsorships, rankings, and public opinion generally will attach to that individual and not to a locker room. Crucially, there is no accusation of dragging down an entire organization, squad, or teammate along with that person. Team sports are different. The responsibility is explicitly collective. Success and failure are framed as shared, regardless of individual contribution. Any perceived distraction is framed as harming teammates, chemistry, or focus. Media and fans ask, what does this do to the room, rather than what does this cost the individual? And moral language enters the conversation very quickly. There's a real shift in the framing. In individual sports, personal truth is framed as courage or self-expression. In team sports, while in the short term, the personal truth can be courage or self-expression, if it causes downstream distraction, then it can be reframed as selfishness, disloyalty, or putting yourself above the team. Hockey is particularly extreme about this. It's true that hockey isn't the only team sport, so the question becomes, why does it feel more shut down than the others? Hockey's team-first culture isn't just rhetoric. It is enforced behaviour from a very young age. The players are socialised very early on in life to disappear into systems, lines, and roles. Media training emphasises cliches, deflection, and ritual humility. Scrums reward sameness and punish deviation. So hockey feels different from other team sports like soccer. Star culture is openly acknowledged. Personal narratives, relationships, and identities are already part of the coverage, and individual brilliance is allowed to coexist with team success. In the NBA, the league markets players first and teams second. Personal brands are expected and are not treated as distractions. Players speaking about identity or politics has been normalized, even when it's controversial. In the NFL, this is still very conservative culturally, but positional isolation diffuses blame. Individual players are more easily framed as separate from overall team performance, and media access is less repetitive than daily NHL scrums. Baseball, they have long seasons, but less daily emotional scrutiny. Stars can recede into the background for stretches without moral judgment. Hockey is probably different for a variety of reasons. There are smaller rosters and tighter bench rotations. Constant line juggling makes chemistry feel fragile. Lower scoring amplifies perceived disruption. And one narrative shift is believed to affect outcomes disproportionately. Personal lives are a risk category, which is why the journalists rarely ask about relationships, family, or identity. In fact, they're not allowed. Players' personal lives are tightly contained, and privacy is treated as a performance requirement, which is why, unless a player brings it up himself, you will very rarely see the media asking about girlfriends, wives, family members. So the unspoken rule is don't become the story and don't widen the lens beyond hockey. The fear underneath it all, I suspect, is that once one personal boundary is crossed, others will follow. A discussion about a player's sexuality invites sustained questions about relationships, intimacy, and private life. In a culture that's built on containment, I'm sure that loss of control would be quite existential. So there is a star player paradox. Even though hockey insists very relentlessly that it is a team sport and players are trained to say the right things and that it's never about one guy, at the same time, particularly within this season, we can very clearly see that there are individual catalysts amongst quite a few of the teams that are playing in the NHL this season. Current visible examples where individual impact is undeniable: Connor Bedard in the Chicago Blackhawks. Lineups, results, and national attention shift dramatically around his presence, and the franchise's short-term competitiveness is visibly tied to him. When he's injured, they don't play so well. Macklin Celebrini of the San Jose Sharks is already treated as a cornerstone, despite being very young and despite this being so early in his career. Media narratives routinely frame the rebuild around him. Matthew Schaefer of the New York Islanders. His individual performance have disproportionately influenced outcomes, and he is being treated as a structural solution, not a roster piece. Cutter Gauthier and Leo Carlsson of the Anaheim Ducks. Their development arcs are openly discussed as central to the team's future, and the rebuild of the team narrative hinges on their progress. Slightly older players who I'm also going to use as examples. Connor McDavid from the Edmonton Oilers. The team's success visibly collapses or surges around his availability, and his statistical dominance is impossible to disguise as purely collective. Quinn Hughes, when he was with the Vancouver Canucks, his on-ice impact reshaped possession, pace, and outcomes, and the team's ceiling and floor were very clearly tied to him. But if you watch media performances, post-game scrums always sound very similar regardless of the player involved. Answers are immediately redirected to the performance of the group, the guys in the room, everyone buying in, everyone doing my job for the team. We've got a great group of guys here. Individual excellence is always actively downplayed even when it's obvious. This isn't accidental, it's clearly very trained behavior. The reason this matters is that the league depends on stars to drive results, revenue, and attention. San Jose is trading heavily on Macklin Celebrini's celebrity fame. But while the league relies on stars, it does resist them becoming visible as complex individuals off the ice. Their individual impact is celebrated massively on the ice, but efforts are made to contain it everywhere else. Any narrative that centers the individual too explicitly is risky. That tension sits at the heart of why personal visibility feels threatening in hockey. We see this emphasis everywhere, and I have got videos elsewhere that talk about hockey relationships and that sort of stuff. The loyalty of players to their teams and the sacrifice brings with it a huge amount of weight and cost. The baseline expectation in hockey is that players will routinely sacrifice their personal life for the team. This sacrifice is not considered exceptional. It is normalized and celebrated. The enduring loss is quietly framed as professionalism. But what that looks like in practice is stuff like family time missed or deprioritized, and this is a given, playing through injury or compromised health, emotional restraint and limited vulnerability in public, which is why you'll often see these video clips of NHL players crying and being emotional, because it's kind of seen as being a bit strange and funny. Personal needs deferred in favour of team rhythm and focus. The way the culture frames disruption is that anything that challenges the team narrative is treated with suspicion. Anything that disrupts the team narrative is often framed as betrayal rather than self-preservation. It is cast as selfishness rather than autonomy, and it is judged in moral terms, not structural ones. In recent times, I've seen even very work-related issues filtered through this moral lens. For example, Connor McDavid's recent contract negotiations. These were entirely professional, work-related, and expected in any other industry. But these were still framed by many as a potential distraction to teammates. A lot of the coverage focused on timing, commitment, and whether or not this was putting the team first. It was very rarely framed as just a normal labour negotiation. More recently, what about Quinn Hughes's departure from the Canucks, when there was a lot of discussion about his future? His years of loyalty were treated as baseline obligation, not earned credit. Uncertainty about staying was framed as abandonment or disloyalty. Structural and organisational shortcomings were sidelined, and emotional narratives about leadership and sacrifice were prioritised instead. Regardless of your opinions on the above, the reason they're relevant is that even something like contract negotiations and career planning can get moralized in that way. You can imagine that deeply personal disclosures about sexuality would be magnified even further. So if you extend the logic, you could see how coming out could be framed as choosing yourself over the room, prioritizing personal truth over collective focus, and introducing risk into a culture that seems to value containment above all else. Relevant to something I've discussed before about hockey relationships is this band of brothers problem. For the players, locker room bonds feel very intense and real. They spend more time with teammates than with their partners, families, or friends during the NHL season. There's a shared pressure of pain, travel, and routine that creates a sense of intimacy that feels unique and very real. The brotherhood language also isn't accidental. It is very actively reinforced by teams and the media. The reason these bonds feel sacred is that winning and losing together forges emotional shortcuts. The trust on the ice depends on believing the person next to you will do their job, and that reliance creates genuine attachment and loyalty in the moment. The uncomfortable truth, as I've flagged in other videos, is that these relationships are actually structurally temporary. Trades, waivers, call-ups, and demotions are very routine. Brothers one moment can be opponents in the next game. The business side of the league overrides personal bonds without hesitation. The contradiction at the heart of all of this is that players are encouraged to treat the locker room as the most important relationship in their lives. They're asked to subsume long-term personal needs to it. And even though the league itself treats these bonds as expendable, they're supposed to put these bonds above all else. The way this affects personal truth is that long-term identity and relationships exist outside the season, but the team exists in defined windows that can end abruptly. And so players are asked to prioritize something fleeting over something that should be permanent. The reason this matters for openness is that coming out introduces a truth that you can't just pack away at the end of a season. It asks teammates and media to acknowledge the player beyond the current roster. In a culture that is built around short-term cohesion, this permanence can feel very disruptive. The pressure is to not introduce anything that might outlast the room. Don't make the season carry anything more than it does. Don't force a temporary group to hold a permanent truth. And the thing is, coming out cuts across all of those. So in closing, why this discourse matters, even if you don't really care about the issues that are specifically being discussed. If we return to Scott Hunter, for me, his choice reads less like fear and more like triage and a decision about survival focus and limits. He had a plan to come out after he retired, when his decision wouldn't affect his teammates or anyone else. So this video isn't about me trying to propose solutions. I certainly don't have any answers for this. All I'm trying to do is discuss an issue that I feel like gets left out of a lot of these conversations, because most people will focus on the issue of a lack of diversity or homophobia or toxic culture in hockey culture. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to widen the frame beyond a single explanation and show that this issue isn't only about individual prejudice or locker room attitudes, and how structure, media incentives, and team first culture have basically compounded the problem. It's not just so simple as saying, well, if the other players are okay with it, why don't they just come out? Or if they have pride nights and there's like pride tape and people are okay about these issues, why don't people just come out? And so the reason I wanted to flag the issue is that you can't really address a problem if you don't fully understand all the implications to it. And if the conversation only stays at the level of homophobia, then this part of the systemic pressure, I think, will remain invisible. In the NHL, coming out doesn't just reveal who you love, it completely changes the conditions under which you're allowed to exist as a normal player and a member of the team.